Welcome to another Monday and another episode of Behind the Numbers. This week we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Vaillancourt. He's an ED physician and senior scientist with the Ottawa Hospital with interests in pre-hospital care and specifically improving care and survival outcomes for cardiac arrest and trauma patients. Dr. Vaillancourt tells us about how he developed his interest in pre-hospital care at an early age, as well as his current research and specifically his world-renowned work with the Canadian Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. We learn about the biggest barriers in achieving a fast response to cardiac arrest, as well as how we can quickly make the decision on when to give CPR if we see someone in medical distress. We also chat about the future of pre-hospital care, which includes technologies like drones and artificial intelligence. And we also touch on his successful athletic career as a duathlete and triathlete. He's represented Canada at a couple of world championships. So Dr. Vaillancourt tells us how he's able to time manage and prioritize his hobbies while handling such a busy and successful career. Last but not least, Dr. Vaillancourt also tells us about his experience with COVID as an ED physician. This episode is filled with so many interesting things. It's so informative, it's so cool. I really hope you enjoy. Have a great time. Welcome to Behind the Numbers, Dr. Vaillancourt. Very excited to have you on.
Thank you. That's very fun. That's cool what you're doing.
Yeah. So I want to start with, you're an emergency physician in Ottawa at the Ottawa Hospital. How did you get into medicine? How did you make the decision to have this as your career path?
All right. I'll give you my usual story. So way back, it starts in my childhood, actually. I was a downhill ski racer on the weekends. I was a young chap, and my father was a St. John ambulance ski patrol. So I spent my weekends essentially in the ski shack, seeing injured people with broken bones, neck injuries, cuts, and so on. Participated in chairlift evacuation exercises. And it just so happened that most of my father's friends doing this were also some of them paramedics, nurses, firemen. So even when we went camping in the summer with these guys, these folks, these are the people I grew up with. So that kind of gave me the bug of, first of all, first aid, emergency medicine, but also pre-hospital care. And that's the interest I maintained really when I went through medical school. When I started residency in emergency medicine, most likely because of this experience, I was also interested to join the pre-hospital medicine field. So I was in Montreal at the time. And what you need to understand is when I was doing this in the late 90s, there were no advanced care paramedics in Montreal. What they had instead was more of a French SAMU-like system where they had doctors on the road. That was pretty cool, actually. So when you're a 20-some-year-old guy and ride in a pursuit car, we had like race car seats with 5-point restraints, and we were driving really fast to cardiac arrest and traumas and so on. And I really like doing this, except that very often, especially overnight, I was the only doctor going to these cases for all of Montreal and Laval. So we're talking about 1 million population. And by the time we got to where we had to be, often the paramedics were already ready to go to the hospital. And the right thing to do was to let them go. So over an 8-hour shift doing this, I may have maybe 4 patient encounters, which was fun for me to do. But then I was thinking, if I work a shift in the emergency department, I can see at the time 30 patients instead. So I like doing this, but I didn't feel I could have the impact I wanted to have. And I think when it comes to doing research, I may have had the same thought process. So I feel privileged in the emergency department. We work with a team of people that will literally save people's lives on a regular basis, right? It's a team sport. It's never often you're not the only person responsible to do this, but let's just say over a 30-some-year career, I may have the chance to participate in saving the lives of a couple of hundred people, and that's great. But the research we do every day, just the things we set up in public health and some interventions that are still ongoing after we do some studies about them, that saves the lives of hundreds of people every year. So with that in mind, that's in great part why I wanted to get involved in, 1, emergency medicine, and 2, in research. And there's a bit of a lifestyle choice as well as whether or not you want to work in an academic setting, if you want to work just do your work, go home and do nothing else. This is a bit of a choice as well, and I chose to get involved a little bit more.
So before we move into your research, I have two more questions about the pre-hospital. So you knew from early on that you wanted to be in pre-hospital settings, pre-hospital research. How did you make the decision then to go into the med route versus paramedicine?
It's a good question. I was good in school, and I guess I had the option to consider going to medicine. Surprisingly, you realize when you consider going into medical school that quite as difficult as making it into the NHL, but you do realize that not everybody makes it, right? And I was so I wanted to do that. As I was submitting my applications, it just dawned on me, if I don't get in, what else am I going to do? And I did not have much of a second choice at the time. I was considering things like physiotherapy, which I thought were closest to what I wanted to do. Why did I never consider becoming a paramedic? I guess because at the time as well, what I knew of paramedics were basic care paramedics. I did not know of advanced care paramedicine. That would have been interesting. Knowing what I know now, I think that a good alternative career for me would have been perhaps respiratory therapy. They work in the operating room, they work in the ED with us, they're central in any resuscitation efforts as well. And within the paramedical field, except perhaps nursing, they're probably very close to what I do as an emergency physician. So that's something I did not know about that I would certainly have considered a career if I did not get into medicine.
So now you are an ED physician and you work in research, and one of the big projects is CANROC, which is the Canadian Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. Can you tell me about how you got into this and sort of what you do with this project?
Yeah, well, that's also a big part of why I came to Ottawa. Before CANROC, there was ROC. Before ROC, there was OPALS. OPALS was the Ontario Pre-Hospital Advanced Life Support. And if you go way back, we were talking about advanced care paramedicine versus basic life support paramedicine. In Ontario in the early 90s, maybe I should go even one step back. So what is advanced care paramedicine? It really goes back to the Vietnam and Korean Wars. Paramedics were paratroopers. They were essentially military people that were parachuted into difficult access area to save the lives of soldiers and so on. So before that period of time, we're talking in the 60s and 70s, there was no advanced life support care from anybody else but physicians. So these wars are over. We have these highly trained paratroopers now. They're coming back in society. And they seem to have been able to help save lives of soldiers. So the next question was, why don't we continue to use them for emergencies in communities outside of a war setting? So these became the first advanced care paramedics. So there was lots of pressures in the early 90s in Ontario to train paramedics as advanced care paramedics as they had done in the States, Seattle first and other places. And Dr. Steele at the time, he's also a well-known researcher in Ottawa, posed the question, well, what is the real advantage of advanced care paramedicine for cardiac arrest specifically? Because the advanced skills they have, the drugs they use, intubation and so on, that in itself, above and beyond just good quality CPR and a quick shock, did not seem to make much of a difference in outcomes for cardiac arrest. So his question was, do we need to invest in advanced care paramedicine if the advanced skills they have are not known to make a change in cardiac arrest survival? Mm-hmm. So the government tasked him to look at and study the benefits of having advanced care paramedics. So that was the Ontario Pre-Hospital Advanced Life Support study that was led by Dr. Steele. And part of the reason why I came to Ottawa is because that study became the largest cardiac arrest registry in the world. It gathered 10,000 cases over a 10-year period. And at the time, there was nothing bigger than this really going on. So the results of this are many-fold. As it turns out, advanced care paramedics don't save more lives of cardiac arrest victims, but they do save the lives of some trauma patients, and they make a big impact, of course, in many other settings. This is why we still have advanced care paramedicine today. But once OPALS was done its studying, it joined a larger group of 11 centers of excellence throughout North America, in the US and Canada, called ROC, the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. In Canada, we had the Ottawa OPALS communities. At first, there were 21 communities in OPALS. It's much a smaller group now. Toronto was doing some work in cardiac arrest as well, in the province of BC. So those were the 3 Canadian centers in ROC. ROC was a very large enterprise. It got millions of dollars in funding from organizations like CIHR, Heart and Stroke, but also the NIH in the US, which is a very large funding agency. And it funded the registry, so to speak, of cardiac arrest and many of its studies over many years, about a 10-year period. The NIH at the end of the 10 years said, you've been the most productive network we've ever funded, but now we have to move on. So long. So all of a sudden, 10 years of cardiac arrest research is out the window and left all the centers to wonder how are we going to continue doing this? As it turns out, the Canadian centers, just the 3 centers out of 11 in ROC, were really able to collect 60% of all the patients in all the cardiac arrest research that was undertaken by ROC. So we were a very big, significant partner in this. So because of this, CIHR and Heart and Stroke decided that it was important to keep the Canadian cardiac arrest network alive. So they've funded what has become CANROC, the Canadian Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. But they did give us a challenge. They said, we're not just interested in large urban centers. And by the way, it's good to have 2 provinces involved, but we want the entire country. We want all of Canada to be involved. So 5 years later, we finally succeeded in having centers in every province in the country. We have a registry that will imminently become available as well. And we've also joined forces with France, the entire country. So now there's also REACT CANROC, which is a large cardiac arrest registry, including the entire French population and Canadian population. And we're planning to look at differences in outcomes based on our respective systems. I mentioned that there's big differences in the European French approach, where they send doctors in the field still and they stay and play, we call it, for a very long time, resuscitating people even in metros and so on with very fancy things that we can only do in hospital in Canada. And for us, we have more of a scoop and run approach, where you get there, you try to do things as quickly as possible, and then you transport fast to the hospital. So there's variations and differences that we're looking forward to study as well, comparing both countries. So it will become, again, a very significantly large cardiac arrest network.
So when you're looking at these patients and trying to improve their outcome after they had a cardiac arrest, what are the biggest barriers that are is it just the fact that it's such a obviously risky mechanism that it's so difficult to have a positive outcome, or are there certain things that can be done to make it better?
Yeah, so you're starting your thesis work. When I came to Ottawa, my thesis work was on understanding why our bystander CPR rates were so low. So I joined Ottawa in the year 2000. I started my master's at that time. Back then, the bystander CPR rate was 15%. What this means is when the paramedics got to the scene of a cardiac arrest, maybe 1 time out of 8, someone was actually pushing on their chest and doing chest compressions. That's awful. So that means most of the time people were doing nothing, just waiting for the ambulance to arrive. And not surprisingly, the survival rate of out of hospital cardiac arrest back then was 3 to 4%. Think about this, 95 to 96% of victims died. What this also means is, put yourself in the shoes of a paramedic now. Your entire career going to these cardiac arrest calls, you may very likely never ever see a survivor with these odds. So the next time you get called for a cardiac arrest, how quickly are you going to get there? What's your mindset about how important your job is to save that person when you've never seen a survivor really? So these low bystander CPR rates were still low in spite of many efforts at the time to promote CPR classes and have people get certified in CPR and so on. And so part of my thesis was understanding why these numbers are low and also how to fix them. As it turns out, there's many different societal ideas that people get wrong. For example, most people think that the most likely cardiac arrest victim is going to be someone they don't know on the street. They usually picture an older man. The whole distastefulness of doing mouth-to-mouth as well is a big turn-off for people. That's part of why the resuscitation guidelines took out mouth-to-mouth for lay people, non-healthcare professionals, just professions. But the fact of the matter is, 85% of cardiac arrests happen at home. So that's going to be a family member most of the time. So when you think this way, all of a sudden it's no longer an altruistic thing that you do for someone else. Now you look around and you say, that could be my spouse, right? So the most likely provider will be, unfortunately, the women of a 69, 70-year-old man who will have to do CPR. Those are just the statistics. Of course, cardiac arrest can happen at any age, but this is a bit more commonly in men and a bit more commonly later in life. So doing all this work, as it turns out, what seemed to make a biggest difference was the ability of, when you call 911 communication officers, the person you get on the other side of the phone, if they give you CPR instructions when you call someone in cardiac arrest, as it turns out, it's what made the biggest difference, the fastest, so to speak. When we looked at the national statistics at the time, Ontario had a bystander CPR rate of about 15%. The rest of the country was closer to 30 or 35%. We did not really know why at the time, and then we found out later on that Ontario was the last province in the country to adopt dispatch-assisted CPR instructions. Within months of doing this, on April 2004, our bystander CPR rates all of a sudden went up to about 30%. And this is after decades of trying to move that needle unsuccessfully. Dispatch-assisted CPR instruction made a big difference.
Wow.
Now, you're asking about challenges and what else we can continue to improve upon. It's not going to be possible for these 911 telecommunicators to recognize cardiac arrest all the time, because when you think about it, sometimes people call 911, they're not even close to the victim. So if they're being asked questions, they're not even there. So it cannot be 100%. But when we started to look at their ability, again, using the CAN-ROC database and the ROC database, we knew exactly which cardiac arrest cases existed. And when we looked back, the 911 communication officers were able to recognize maybe 65 to 70% of them. So they were missing the boat about 30% of the time. Then we tried to understand why that was. And for half of those missed cardiac arrest cases, it seemed to be because the victim had abnormal breathing. Now, 5 seconds about physiology. When you collapse, when your heart stops beating and there's no oxygen going onto your brain, the cortex, the surface of your head, is what is responsible for your being able to be alert and have a conversation like we're having one right now. Your brainstem is what controls your breathing. And that's another word for it is the reptilian brain, and it's a bit more resilient to lack of oxygen and sugar and so on. So when a person first collapses, they can still occasionally gasp for air and take a breath every once in a while. So circling back to the most likely victim is going to be a family member, you see them collapsed on the ground, you think they're dead, and then all of a sudden they take a breath. Your first reaction will be, and we've heard this, oh, so he must be alive. Of course, you don't want to accept the fact that they might be dead and you need to do something about it. So you're clinging on to any sign of life they can provide to you. And the communication officers do the same thing as well. When someone over the phone describes that someone just took a breath and they're about to tell you to pump their chest and maybe break a few ribs, and that's okay to do that, they're also hesitant to give you these instructions. So there's some psychological barriers as well as some knowledge gaps that we've identified that we wanted to correct. So we use something called the theory of planned behavior. So I got involved in social measures and qualitative research, which is something that was absolutely not part of my master's. or that I learned anything about in the Master of IP. So another lesson is you never stop learning in this field. So I got familiar with qualitative data research. And so we understood what the barriers were. We developed an intervention, an educational tool to improve their performance. We tested that in Ottawa, compared that to another community. And as it turns out, we were able to improve their performance. So our communications officer in Ottawa now, with more information and examples of what eyeball breathing looks like, they're able to recognize cardiac arrest faster, more accurately, and it seems to have further improved ambassador CPR rates, even higher. And there's even a suggestion that it might impact survival. It's too small of a study for this, but right now we're implementing the same intervention across the country in many new sites, and we're just about to we just received the last ethics approval yesterday, actually, to go ahead from BC. So just about to start this study now. It's going to be a national multi-center study.
Oh, that'll be great.
So, yeah.
And so if you had to give the ideal instruction for CPR, like, would you just say give it to anybody as soon as they collapse, or is there anything else to look for? Like, if you were to give the gold standard CPR, when to do it?
So I'm glad you bring this up as well. And I would say part of the biggest challenge about the whole community response to cardiac arrest, it's not so much the skills. We kind of took out mouth-to-mouth breathing. You don't really need to do this if you're not a healthcare professional. To learn how to do chest compressions, where to put your hand, how deep, how fast, that's pretty easy. You can learn this with a pillow at home. It's not a difficult skill. The most difficult skill is what you've just asked, is when is it the right time to do this? And is it my responsibility to do it? We also know from social sciences that surprisingly, if you have someone on the ground and you have 15 people around that person is less likely to have anybody do something about it than if there's only one or two people. When you look at somebody else's eyes and you say, okay, we need to do something about it, and there's only you and somebody else, someone will do something. When there's a big group of people, it's called diffusion of responsibility. It's going to be somebody else's job to help. So that's a big barrier. But to go back to your question, when is the right time to do this, is the biggest psychological barrier that people have to actually start to do something about it. And there's what the communication officers use when you call 911. There's three main questions. Is the person conscious? Are they breathing? And if they're breathing, are they breathing normally? If they're not breathing normally and they're unconscious, they're in cardiac arrest. Yes, they might have something else going on, like a very low sugar level. But if they are in cardiac arrest and you don't do anything, they're dead. If they only have like their head or another reason why they're unconscious and not breathing normally, if you do CPR, worst that can happen really, you might break a rib or two, but at least you're trying to save their lives. And this small risk of doing some harm is far, far outweighed by the possibility of saving their lives. And by the way, the survival rate now overall in the pre-hospital field, it's not 3 or 4% anymore. Now it's 12 to 15%.
Wow.
If you have a cardiac arrest in the hospital, it's closer to 25%. Now when you speak to paramedics, they're enthusiastic because they've pretty much all heard or seen or treated a survivor now. And now we're starting to put survivors together back with their revivers, with the paramedics, the communication officers, the people who did CPR. And that's very, very powerful. And that's an advantage of CanRock as well. We have a community, a committee of survivors now who actually are helping us set up the priorities for the whole network. So it's not just the researchers like myself deciding what other question we're going to ask. Now we have survivors telling us what their biggest interests are in cardiac arrest research, and they're informing us of that as well. So people are alive now. They're surviving cardiac arrest. It's not the end of the road anymore for many people. And those who survive, by the way, are in great shape. They're not, disabled, or of course this happens in some rare cases, but the majority of survivors, they go back to their usual life and activities.
Do you find that, you mentioned that most of the people who have cardiac arrest are older or are males, But in, say, younger demographics or the rest of them, are there certain risk factors that you find are prevalent in these people who happen to get a cardiac arrest?
Yeah, so if you're a little bit older, right? If you're in your late 60s or 70s, of course you're more likely to have had over your lifetime high blood pressure, diabetes, or what I say is there's rust in the pipes, right? So the coronary vessels, they're a little bit narrowed, and that's most likely the reason why you're going to have a cardiac arrest. For younger people, it's usually not a plumbing issue. It's usually more an electric issue. So people have arrhythmias. Some of them are familial. So there's genetic testing as well involved if people are having a cardiac arrest. Risk factors, other than that, for young people, I would say substance abuse. So there are some people who use amphetamines, cocaine, crack, and things like this. And I would say that probably ages their heart by at least 10 or 20 years in terms of what we see in the anatomy when we look at the vessels and so on. But it's funny you ask, because just a couple of weeks ago, there was a 28-year-old nurse who was out for a run. She was done.
I
She was
read
cooling
that.
down. Yeah, and she collapsed.
Yeah.
She was essentially dead, and she was revived immediately by two maids, Molly maids that were working in the building. The AED was applied quickly. She survived. Actually, I had a conversation with her just yesterday. Now she's at home recovering.
Wow.
She is neurologically completely intact. She's going to go back to being a labor and delivery nurse soon.
Wow.
As soon as COVID is over.
Yeah.
So that person would have been dead if it wasn't for the entire chain of survival who got into action to keep her alive. And there's many more stories like this. I've met 17-year-olds that had a cardiac arrest event swimming in a pool, and they're likely they didn't drown at the same time. But we have more and more young people survive cardiac arrest. Now you see the importance of what we're trying to set up to help that population. And these people have a lifetime ahead of themselves. And in terms of risk factors, unfortunately, many of those had very little. Many of them actually were also very healthy people. If you Google soccer players as well, you'll see that there's been a number of them on the soccer field suffering a cardiac arrest. So some of them are actually very good and well-trained athletes. The majority of times, we think there's a structural issue, either with their hearts or electrical system that has not been recognized since birth. And there's some people I know that spend their research interest is about sports-related cardiac arrest in younger people. So this is a field of research that is interesting, and we don't know all the answers just yet. Why some younger people even can have cardiac arrest.
Back to the story of the nurse who had the AED applied quickly. So I know that's a direction that you are looking at in terms of how to facilitate getting AEDs to a cardiac arrest as fast as possible. And I think drones are one of the potential sort of liaising equipment to do that. Which sounds like a very cool project.
I'll get the drones in the middle because that's the future. But I want to start in the hospital setting per se.
Yeah.
So I wear two hats, right? So I'm a pre-hospital cardiac arrest researcher. I'm also the chair of our cardiac arrest committee at the Ottawa Hospital, and you can't fix what you don't measure. So surprisingly, we have excellent statistics in the pre-hospital world. We know the response time, the number of time people survive, what their initial rhythm is when we get to them. We had very little information for in-hospital cardiac arrest. And by the way, this is the case for most hospitals anywhere. You don't really monitor cardiac arrest. It's almost shameful because I don't know if it's perceived as a failure, but so we started to measure our statistics. And surprisingly, you can, by the time you call 911 and by the time you get your first shock, if you have a cardiac arrest, anywhere outside the hospital, the average time it takes is about 8 minutes. When we looked at our statistics in the hospital, in an area that was not a monitored area, so not in the intensive care, not in the emergency department, our average time from discovering cardiac arrest to the first shock being given was 10 to 12 minutes.
So it's
you
almost
were more likely to have a shock faster by a paramedic or a firefighter on the road than you were in the hospital.
Wow.
So we started to look at why this was the case. And then we discovered that if you look at the nursing practice, nurses have within their scope of practice about 12 or 13 medical delegated acts, like starting an intravenous is one, doing a cardiogram is one, but delivering an electrical shock is not part of them. Now, we need to say something about the Good Samaritan law and the Chase-McEachern law as well. So these are things that protect people. If you're not a healthcare professional, you come to the cardiac arrest scene, you try something, even if you cause a little bit of harm, the Good Samaritan law, the Chase-McEachern law, they protect you. The Chase-McEachern is for the application of an AED. You can't be sued for trying, right? Because you've tried your best. The same rules do not apply during in-hospital cardiac arrest.
Wow.
So essentially, we discovered that the nurses were not allowed to give a shock quickly, even though they're the first ones there. So the first thing we changed, we had to have a medical directive signed by all the physicians working at the hospital every year, allowing our nurses to use a defibrillator in an AED mode. And the minute we did that, we've seen many cases now where a shock was given within 3 minutes. That's fantastic. That's what the guidelines say should happen. So we were able to fix this in the hospital. Most other hospitals are still not able to accomplish this. So that's AED in hospital. Now, AED in the community, that's another challenge. That's one of them. So again, we have to remind ourselves that 15% only of cardiac arrest occur in a public arena where traditionally AEDs are available. But the other challenge is how can we bring an AED quickly to someone who has a cardiac arrest at home? In big apartment buildings, now they're starting to put them at different levels, different floors, because we've also found out that if you live on a high rise, at the upper levels, your response times are also terrible because it takes a long time for paramedics to get there. So a lot of these apartment buildings have AEDs now at different floors. But there's also an increasing number of community response organizations like Neighbors Helping Neighbors and things like this, where if you have a cardiac arrest even at home, if you're a volunteer, you can have a message on your app telling you exactly where the cardiac arrest is or the closest AED is, and you can try to bring one to even someone's home before the paramedics arrive. There's that. And then there's something that has not really been measured enough yet, which is some of the iniquities of care delivery with regards to where you live. So rural versus urban, and people think that, wherever you live in Canada, you should have access to the same good medical care. That can't be true, right? If you live 30 minutes away from the closest fire hall or ambulance, there's no way you can have a shock delivery within 8 minutes. So the thing about drones is interesting because, of course, you fly. You don't have to follow the roads, and you can fly and quickly go and deliver a drone. And Dr. Cheskis in Toronto and Mike Nolan as well, Renfrew, are leading some of these initiatives. And the biggest hurdles are legal, mostly to fly a drone, what is called beyond line of sight, where you don't see your drone anymore. You need special permission by the FAA to be able to do this, and other organizations. But this is moving forward. It's exciting, and it's not just drones. You can think about also EpiPen and blood and some other products that can be delivered this way. I guess there will be a time very soon where these things are going to be whizzing over our heads all the time. That might be something different. Other technologies that are coming as well, which are exciting. Things that 20 years ago I never thought would be possible. If you look at cardiac arrests as well, half of the victims, they're unwitnessed. So the definition of being a witnessed cardiac arrest is someone sees you collapse or hears you collapse, and then they can quickly go and help you. But unfortunately, half the victims, they are discovered hours later, and it's too late. There's nothing you can do when so much time has passed. But now we have things like FitBits, Apple Watches, smart speakers, and these things have been already known to be able to detect if someone is fallen on the floor and they can't move for a while. They can detect cardiac arrest. The biggest challenge at this moment is to make sure that their accuracy is high enough that it does not alert the healthcare systems too often. But these are technologies that exist now, and that's blowing our minds that perhaps people will, although they might be alone at home, they might still be able to call 911. At least their device might be able to do this and still dispatch someone to help them, whereas the only outcome possible for that person in the past would have been death. So there's a large proportion of the cardiac arrest community or population that could soon be addressed by that.
I hadn't even thought of that application of smartwatches at all, but that's wow. I need to get one.
Yeah. And of course, all of this involves things like artificial intelligence. And this is also something that we're looking in the future to do as well, even with our intervention with the communication officers. It's one thing to give them more information about how to recognize cardiac arrest, but they have a script to follow, right? So are you conscious, breathing normally? They have questions to ask you, and they kind of have to go through their question list. But what if I told you that, well, when someone's opening statement when they call 911 is, I think my spouse is dead. What if I told you that, well, when they start by saying this, in big likelihood, that person is in cardiac arrest and you don't need to ask any more questions. Mm-hmm. That's actually true. So what we're hoping to do is in collaboration with IBM Watson as well. So IBM Watson is the computer that won Jeopardy and beat the Russian chess master and so on. We're hoping to develop AI protocols that will help IBM Watson listen into the conversation during 911 calls. Wow. And just on the shoulder of the communication officer and say, by the way, I have enough information to tell you now, this is a cardiac arrest. Stop your questions, start CPR instructions. So this is also the direction in which we're going. There's already some advancements in that field being done in Europe with CORE-T, for example. So we know it's possible to do, and this is another thing that we're trying to develop over the next coming years.
Do you think that we're going into an area then where dispatch may be entirely AI responses, like fully automated, or no?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't. Yeah, we thought the same thing of automation for industry, right, many years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's a bit of a myth that we can be replaced by machines. I think that there's a human component to things that will never be replaced, but I think we can have our performance enhanced by AI. I don't think it will ever replace us entirely.
Okay, good. I know I'm keeping you a bit over time. I just have a couple more questions. Do you have time?
No problem.
Okay.
Of course, yes.
So throwing it way back to when you mentioned that our hearts are kind of like rusted pipes as we age, and bring it back to health. So you're a very avid cyclist, duathlete, triathlete. You've represented Canada at a few world championships. How in the world do you manage all the work that you're doing with all this training? That's something that
first of all, that's
me so much.
That's a very generous comment coming from such a decorated athlete such as yourself, Gabby. And just to clarify, there are many people who can swim, bike, and run faster than I do. There's just a much smaller number who can do all three of them with a decent pace and transition between sports as fast as I can. But it's a challenge. And for me, what worked best to be able to try to, at least from a training perspective, make it work is to schedule it in. When I used to only train when I could, there was always a good excuse for it not to happen. The minute I started to literally hardwire schedule this into my calendar is my coping strategy. So I consider it as an appointment. I block the time. I make sure I don't have meetings overlapping these training sessions, and I guess that's one of the secrets is to protect this time and schedule it in.
Yeah, that's a good point, to treat it like an appointment, because I know that's where sometimes my struggles come in, is when I start getting very busy, I think of it as something that can be postponed. And that's where things start to snowball and I get so focused. So that's actually a great point to time block it.
It's like with your finances, pay yourself first and then you do the rest.
And then, so my second question on that one, if you have times where you are busier and say you can't train as much as other times, how do you, when you come back, I know something that's difficult for me or for other athletes sometimes is knowing what your numbers were before, and now you're trying to get back to that. How do you not kind of get demotivated in your training if you see that you're like more fatigued or you're not quite where you were, and to work to get back to where you were while you're working in the ED and with the paramedics and everything else, and just not letting that be an extra stress on your life?
I think what you and I have in common is, if we're interested in research, that means we're probably monitoring pretty closely some metrics having to do with training and so on, right? So I guess the first thing would be to relax a little bit. I know many athletes who don't monitor things on things like Strava, Training Peaks very much, and they use more the intuitive field, and some of them do very well doing this. I guess it helps if you have a coach to help make these decisions and adjustments for you. I guess the other thing is, well, I know that you were getting ready for some pretty significant competitions at a young age. For me, it's more of a hobby. So first thing I need to remind myself is I'm doing this for fun, right? So not to be too serious about it. Otherwise, when you want to get back to it, you have to accept the fact that you've missed some training sessions and perhaps accept a little bit of a step back. But you can use this time to work on other stuff like strategy and things that are not necessarily done in the gym, thinking about nutrition, race planning, and so on. So these things you can do even between meetings, or it's easier to do that.
And then my last question is a shift from physical health to the mental fortitude and mental strength side. What has it been like with COVID in the ED? I know that's been a big stressor, and how to cope with it. And especially when it was so new, didn't know what was going to come in, how it would affect the hospital, how burdened you all would be. How has the past 6 months been for you?
It's funny. I have been an emergency physician now for a little over 20 years, and I keep track of all the outbreaks we've had to deal with. And there's been many, right? There's been H1N1 and SARS as well. So if you've been doing this for a little bit of time, COVID has not been the first outbreak. It's been perhaps the longest one that I've had to live through so far. And it's funny, we've gone through many phases. I'll speak for myself. The first one was administrative. The very first months, because I guess of my involvement with cardiac arrest committee as well, there were lots of policies and procedures that had to be put into place, how to cope with PPE and different ways of doing things. So there was a very heavy burden of administrative work and meeting and collaboration, especially in the first 3 months. And then what happened in the emergency department after that was, well, people were quarantined and staying at home and everything was shut down. So our numbers went super low. So it was pretty quiet in the emergency department, actually. Nonetheless, we were fortunate to still have a job, so to speak. So I don't say this lightly. We have nothing to complain about, at least from the perspective of having been able to continue work we have in the medical field. I know that many of my surgical colleagues had no work at all to do. They could not operate during this time. They didn't hold clinics and so on. So there's been a bit of this was a hard time to go through for many people, especially those who lost their jobs and outside of the hospital as well. So these were very difficult times. Then there's been a little bit of complacency, and things were getting better right before the second wave hit. And to circle this back to training, it's very funny, actually. I'm looking at my metrics, and I kind of recently overlaid the first and second wave of COVID. And right at the beginning of the first wave, everything shut down. I stopped training completely. Then I went back to it a little bit between the waves, and then the second wave hit, and I've been back to zero again. So it's good and bad. I realize that I'm someone who's highly motivated by a race, probably just so I'm not shamed at it. But if I don't have a goal, I have trouble finding motivation to train.
I'm the same.
We've all learned to do things during this period as well. And if you want to take a look at the positive sides, most of us can now bake our own bread, and we've all learned to play guitar and things like this. But also family-wise, I think it was a good time and to maybe put work, training, and all of these other things aside. And if you had an extra few hours to spend it with family, perhaps realizing that this was a good opportunity, or maybe a reminder that life is fragile. And these were important values to go back to in terms of quality of life and spending time with people. So that as much as we could not spend time together, at least to take the time to either call, Zoom, or do anything else. My girls came back home during this time as well, so that's we spent time with one of my daughter's boyfriend as well. He stayed with us over the summer. So these were actually good times within difficult ones.
That actually reminds me of one last thing that I wanted you to speak about on this. Speaking of time with family and just the whole work-life balance, you actually give very good advice for anyone thinking of wanting to go into medicine. And it's not the classic excited, like, yes, do it, and don't even think about anything else.
Yeah.
So I want you to just say that quickly, because I think that is really helpful.
Yeah, so it's funny. There's no doctors in my family. So when I developed that interest early on, I wanted to meet a few of them and ask them about the job meant, what did you do on a day-to-day basis? And I really expected these couple of doctors I met with to be super enthusiastic. Oh, yes, you want to become a doctor? Of course, you should do this. And it's funny, they all had the same reaction, which was, are you sure you want to do this? And that threw me off a little bit, and now I understand why. They all would have done it again, and I would tell you the same thing. I would absolutely do this again. Did I know what price to pay at the time? Absolutely not. You discover really quickly who your real friends are because you have very little time to spend with them. So the friends that are just casual, that you meet from time to time, and where your friendship is dependent upon the ability to be with these people and do some activities, you lose them all. The family also comes into a habit of sometimes stopping to let you know about family events because more often than not you can't go. So that changes things a little bit. So it's a life commitment, and going back to the expression of work-life balance, I don't know that it exists. I think it's a journey, not a destination. And I think what I would like to use instead is setting expectations and communicating with family members or your spouse and children as well what you're going through. There's balancing family, work, and research. There are times where it's not always possible to spend quality time with people around you. What I would say is communicate with people around you what you're going through and what you're doing, the good and the bad. When you publish a paper, when you get a grant, let them know, because sometimes all they see is you working hard, and let them participate in celebrating your successes. Go out for dinner, let them know, open some champagne or something, let them participate in your successes. Similarly, if you have to spend a few weekends and evenings working on a grant and all they see is that you're not available, let them know why you're doing this. And in some cases, it's like, well, that person and that person that work with me, if I don't get this grant, I have to let them go.
Yeah.
So that puts things into perspective, and then all of a sudden they understand why you're putting so much effort into it. Which is another thing that we didn't talk about a research career as well. As clinicians, you see patients, you get paid. Unless you really mess up, you're never ever going to lose your job. In research, you are the leader of a medium-sized enterprise. It's like running a business. You're only as good as your last grant. If the money doesn't come in, your business has to shut down. And this is stressful because there are people who are dependent upon your success for their livelihood, for their salary and so on. So that's something that is not necessarily the case as a physician, unless you have a clinic and so on, you also have employees. But that's an aspect of being a clinician scientist, which is also not thought very well in the Masters in Clinepi. The whole HR component of how do you hire people, how do you fire people, all the rules that need to be known and followed. These are all things that you need to know, and that so far you need to pretty much learn as you go, or you need a mentor to teach you these things.
Oof. Well,
Hope that helps.
no stress on you, but as a member of your medium-sized enterprise, I very much enjoy having a job. So thank you for all the grants you write.
So far, we've been successful, and going back to COVID, most of our research activities, thankfully, have been able to continue and be minimally affected as well. So that's also something that we've been able to keep everybody employed, which is something I'm proud of. So your job is safe.
Thank you. And thank you for coming on. This was such a lovely chat. And I think it'll be great for both all of our students who either are going and want to go into med or that just need to learn a bit more about how to handle everything that comes with it. And that was very cool. Yeah. I learned a lot myself, even though I'm part of the meetings every month where I hear about it. So that was great.
Glad it could help.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us for another week. I know I say this every time, but this was seriously such a great episode and truly informative. And I think there's something that we can all pick out from this, whether it's how to know when to do CPR or how to know whether we really want to go into med, or even just how to balance our time between the things that we're juggling. As always, please help us get this show out. Share it, like it, subscribe, follow. All the reviews that we've been getting have been amazing, and I really appreciate every single one of you. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next Monday.